He didn't just speak to crowds, he commanded them. A preacher who became prophecy, a voice that could make America tremble and believe in the same breath. To the public, he was the dream, the conscience, the apostle of nonviolence carved into history books and holiday speeches. But away from microphones and spotlights, there was another truth. A man, brilliant, burdened, magnetic, flawed. He preached fidelity while craving warmth. He spoke endlessly of love while quietly breaking hearts. And everywhere he went, women saw both the myth and the man, while federal agents listened, waiting to turn that humanity into a weapon. The FBI called it surveillance. The faithful called it sin. History would call it something far more dangerous, complicated. So who was Martin Luther King Jr. really? A moral giant undone by temptation? Or a human mirror, reflecting the nation that demanded saints, then punished them for being human? He was just 26 years old when America first learned his name. Montgomery, Alabama, December 1955. A city carved up by bus routes, race, and habit. Segregation enforced not just by law, but by routine. When Rosa Parks refused to stand, the city erupted. And in the chaos, the black community turned to a young pastor from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Martin Luther King Jr. did not seek the spotlight. He didn't imagine himself as a symbol. He only intended to steady a frightened community. But the moment he took the pulpit, calm, measured, unhurried, something changed. The room felt charged. By the end of that night, he was no longer just a minister. He was the voice of a movement. Fame arrived like a storm, sudden, relentless, unforgiving. Reporters camped outside his door. The phone rang past midnight. Death threats piled up in the mailbox. Coretta tried to protect their home, but protection meant little in Montgomery. In 1956, a bomb ripped through their front porch. Their baby was inside. When King came home and saw the shattered glass, the smoke, the screams, he didn't shout, he didn't curse, he prayed. That moment, restraint in the face of terror, transformed him into legend. But legends don't get to rest. He began living on the road, mass meetings in Montgomery, conferences in Nashville, fundraisers in Atlanta. He slept wherever churches could place him. Spare bedrooms, borrowed parsonages, segregated hotels with thin walls. To the public, he looked composed. Inside, exhaustion was hollowing him out. In letters from those years, he wrote of the fatigue that eats the spirit faster than the body. Coretta had married a preacher, not a national icon. She practiced her music alone while her husband drifted deeper into public life. Their rare dinners were interrupted by strategy calls and emergency meetings. She never doubted his devotion to the cause, but she could already feel the cost. By 1958, federal eyes were watching. J. Edgar Hoover's FB. I began compiling routine reports on King, classifying him as a rising Negro leader. Officially, the concern was communism, tracing possible influence through his advisor Stanley Levison. Unofficially, the tone told a different story. Subject exhibits strong personal magnetism among female parishioners. One Montgomery Field note observed, bureaucratic language, dangerous curiosity. That autumn, King traveled to New York to promote his first book, Stride Toward Freedom. At a department store in Harlem, a disturbed woman stabbed him with a letter opener. The blade lodged just millimeters from his heart. Doctors warned that even a sneeze could kill him. Recovery changed him. Visitors described him as serene, but distant. as if part of him had already stepped beyond the world. He told Coretta that surviving the attack meant his life no longer belonged entirely to him. In 1959, he traveled to India to study Gandhi. Crowds greeted him like a returning prophet. The reverence unsettled him. It widened the distance between the man and the role. Coretta noted in her diary that he prayed longer, slept less, and carried solitude inside him. When they returned to Atlanta, privacy vanished. Meetings filled every hour. Letters arrived by the thousands. He confessed to Ralph Abernathy that leadership felt like a hotel with no checkout. On long drives between speaking engagements, King spoke not of fame, but loneliness. "The crowds give you power," he said, "but they drain your peace." There is no evidence he strayed during these early years, but the pattern was set: public exaltation, private isolation, relentless pressure. Wherever he traveled, admirers surrounded him, especially women who saw something rare, a man who made faith sound like romance. In 1960, the FBI expanded its file. Hoover's analysts flagged King as having a potential moral weak point. For now, they only listened. Wiretaps were authorized through Levison's line. Agents recorded sermons, logistics, prayers. Nothing scandalous, but they were learning the rhythms of his life. By the end of that year, King was 31, a father of two, and the pastor of a national conscience. To the public, he was unshakable. To himself, he was divided between the saint America demanded and the man he still was. That was the threshold, the moral gravity pulling him upward, and the human hunger pulling him down, already in motion, already waiting for history to collide them. By 1961, the Montgomery boycott was history, but Martin Luther King Jr. was still living inside its echo. He had become more than a leader. He was a moral brand, summoned from state to state to baptize every new protest with legitimacy. Wherever there was a crisis, people wanted King there. Wherever fear rose, they wanted his voice to calm it. Crowds waited at airports. News crews trailed his car. Church women reached for his hand like touching it could transfer courage. He responded with grace, but those closest to him could see the strain. He was sleeping less than 4 hours a night, missing meals, running on coffee and adrenaline, carrying the hollow-eyed fatigue of a soldier who never leaves the front. Coretta stayed home in Atlanta, holding the family together like a quiet backbone. Their letters that year read less like romance and more like logistics, flight times, meeting notes, a reminder to pack clean shirts. She was raising 2 small children while reading headlines about her husband being arrested, threatened, shoved, and smeared. She believed in his mission, but she could feel something happening underneath it. History was slowly replacing marriage as his first covenant. The FBI's watch deepened when the Kennedys entered the White House. In October 1961, Robert Kennedy, under pressure from Hoover, authorized limited wiretaps on King's associates, officially to monitor communist influence, unofficially to monitor King himself. Listening posts went up in New York and Atlanta. Agents reported long nights of phone calls, laughter, conversations that weren't strictly political. There was nothing incriminating, but the moral tone of the reports was changing. The Bureau had moved beyond ideology. They were beginning to profile the man. That same year, the movement expanded fast. Workshops, strategy sessions, travel from town to town. Everything depended on a small inner circle who followed King everywhere. Among them was Dorothy Cotton, 30 years old, educated, charismatic. Newly appointed director of the Citizenship Education Program based at Dorchester Center near Savannah. She trained activists to read, vote, organize, and stand firm under arrest. King admired her intellect. She admired his endurance. Their schedules began to overlap constantly. Birmingham 1 week, Atlanta the next, then Dorchester for training sessions that ran past midnight. Cotton later said, "We were living out of suitcases moving from crisis to crisis." In that rhythm, friendship can blur into something closer. Not necessarily scandal, but intimacy born from exhaustion and shared purpose. They held late-night talks in borrowed church offices after rallies, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and crumpled flyers. Witnesses later recalled how King's voice softened around her, how his laughter came easier. One aide put it bluntly, when he talked to Dorothy, he sounded like himself again. By 1962, FBI analysts noticed her name reappearing on every itinerary. Internal notes flagged her as a constant female associate. The Bureau couldn't prove intimacy, but repetition was enough. Agents logged sightings at Dorchester, at SCLC retreats, at conferences in Atlanta and Birmingham. Those entries, vague as they were, became the soil where later claims would grow, that King's personal life and professional life were intertwined. Inside the movement, few gossiped. Cotton's competence protected her. She was too valuable to lose, too respected to confront, and too visible for anyone to casually accuse. There was an unspoken rule in the inner circle. Whatever existed in private stayed inside the work. Travel vouchers and letters preserved in archives show how closely their roots mirrored each other. Months of shared roads and overlapping schedules. What happened between them remains partly veiled. King never wrote of her beyond praising her work. Cotton, decades later, neither confirmed nor denied anything, calling their bond very close and very human. Those who knew them described warmth, trust, emotional intimacy beyond formality. The FBI, hungry for leverage, labeled her female companion, a phrase they used for any woman who appeared twice in his proximity. For King, it wasn't necessarily scandal. It was solace. He was exhausted, idolized, afraid to admit weakness. In sermons, he warned his followers, the higher the mountain, the deeper the valley beside it. To friends, he confessed something darker. Guilt had become a constant shadow. "There are days," he told Abernathy, "when I feel like God has loaned me to the world and forgotten to call me home." The movement's victories brought no rest. Freedom rides, arrests, sit-ins. Each triumph deepened King's dependence on his closest aides, the people who knew the man beneath the public miracle. The inner circle became his refuge from the crushing expectations of sainthood. Then came 1963. As the March on Washington took shape, Hoover's fixation turned openly personal. He began calling King the most dangerous Negro in America. To Hoover, charisma itself was subversion, and destroying King's moral authority stopped being strategy. It became a mission. Agents began cataloging every woman who appeared more than once at events, names, hotel logs, photographs from banquets. They didn't know who these women were or what they meant to him, but each was filed as potential leverage. The surveillance of a movement had become surveillance of a man. That August, King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke words that lifted the world. The roar of 200,000 voices made him seem untouchable. But when the crowd dispersed and the microphones went silent, he returned to his hotel room and stared out over the Potomac until dawn. He had carried a nation's hope, but felt, as one aide said, completely alone. By autumn 1963, Hoover's agents were convinced that somewhere intimacy would reveal itself. They had fragments, no proof. But the order was clear. Listen harder, dig deeper, find the man beneath the halo. That search was about to become war. By early 1964, Martin Luther King Jr.'s fame had reached a height no black preacher in America had ever known. He was 35 years old. His name was circulating for the Nobel Peace Prize. His face appeared in newspapers across Africa and Europe like a living symbol of moral authority. And at that exact moment, as the world began to sanctify him, the FBI began to dismantle him. J. Edgar Hoover had despised King for years, but now that hatred hardened into policy. In closed meetings, Hoover told his subordinates that King was morally degenerate and had to be exposed before the nation elevated him any further. William Sullivan, Hoover's brilliant and ruthless deputy, took it as a directive. "We must mark him now," Sullivan wrote, "if we are to prevent him from misleading the country." That sentence changed everything. Every field office where King traveled, Atlanta, New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Miami, received expanded clearance for technical coverage, plain language, wiretaps, and hidden microphones. Agents understood the shift immediately. They were no longer hunting communists. They were hunting sin. By February, microphones were active inside hotel rooms at the Willard in Washington, the Americana in New York, and the Dinkler Plaza in Atlanta. These were the spaces King believed were finally private. They weren't. The recordings captured fragments of ordinary life: laughter, small talk, hymns half sung, records spinning, long silences. To most ears, nothing. To Hoover, everything. He ordered analysts to isolate female voices, to transcribe phrases, to interpret tone. If King said, "She's tired," the report read, "Female companion resting." If a woman laughed in the background, the summary became unidentified female, possibly intimate. Meaning was manufactured, context erased. That year, King's orbit widened beyond Dorothy Cotton. She remained constant, still running Dorchester, still traveling, still trusted. But national politics brought new relationships into his life. In Washington, he moved among senators, aides, and activists navigating power from the inside. In Los Angeles, donors and professionals hosted fundraisers where admiration blurred into fascination. Among them was Georgia Davis Powers. They met at a rally in Louisville in early 1964. Powers was already a force, the first black woman elected to the Kentucky State Senate. Sharp, composed, impossible to intimidate. King admired her courage. She admired his steadiness. Their connection deepened through campaign work, long phone calls, and shared travel between conferences. Decades later, Powers would confirm what the FBI could only speculate. Their intimacy, she wrote, grew not from glamour, but from exhaustion and trust. "He was not the man on the podium then," she said. "He was the man who doubted, the man who needed someone to talk to." This relationship, unlike most others, is one historians can verify with confidence. The FBI didn't wait for proof. By mid-1964, Powers' name sat in King's file alongside several others, known, unknown, confirmed, rumored. Each appearance was marked personal association. At the same time, intelligence flowed in from Los Angeles. An informant inside the city's black professional elite reported that King had been spending time with Dolores Evans, the wife of a respected dentist. Evans was elegant, active in church circles, well connected. The informant claimed their correspondence resumed during King's frequent California visits. No letters survive. No witness ever confirmed meetings. But the allegation included a detail Hoover could not ignore: the claim that Evans gave birth to a daughter whose paternity her husband privately questioned. It was never verified. That didn't matter. Hoover underlined the memo in red and wrote one word in the margin: verify. Then another: destroy. Another shadow appeared in Washington. A woman referred to only as the Washington Regular, an administrative assistant in a congressional office sympathetic to civil rights. Her presence appeared repeatedly in hotel logs matching King's visits between 1963 and 1965. The Bureau never recorded her voice, never identified her by name, but her proximity alone generated pages of innuendo. To this day, no historian has conclusively identified her. By the summer of 1964, FBI memos stopped pretending to be about national security. They had become psychological profiles dressed as intelligence. Sullivan wrote, "King's sexual aberrations are a national weakness. He is not fit to lead the Negro people. Exposure must occur before he receives further honors." The honor he meant was obvious: the Nobel Peace Prize. When King was officially named laureate in October, Hoover exploded. He told reporters that King was the most notorious liar in the country. It was an unprecedented breach of protocol. Newspapers condemned it. Inside the Bureau, it was celebrated. Sullivan understood the signal. Escalation was authorized. The plan was no longer subtle: destroy King's morale before Oslo. Agents compiled a dossier labeled Personal Activities, King, Martin L. hotel logs, tape summaries, typed transcripts of what they claimed were compromising sounds. Then came the letter, unsigned, typed, mailed from Miami to Atlanta in late November 1964. Inside, a reel-to-reel tape and a message that read like an execution notice: "You are a complete fraud. There is only one thing left for you to do. You have just 34 days. It was a suicide letter without the courage to sign it. Coretta opened it first. She played the tape. Fragments of laughter, distorted voices, hotel noise spliced into suggestion. She waited for her husband to come home. When he did, she handed it to him without speaking. King listened once, then said quietly, 'This is Hoover.' He understood immediately. The FBI had crossed the line. This was no longer surveillance. It was psychological warfare. That winter, King traveled to Oslo to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. As he spoke about peace and redemption, FBI agents continued logging every movement. One report noted champagne toasts. Another recorded applause. A chilling line read, "Subject calm, unaware of countermeasures." He was aware. He simply refused to let them see him break. The microphones were already waiting for him when he returned. By January 1965, the Bureau's machinery was already in motion. Covert microphones had been installed in every hotel King was known to frequent: Atlanta's Dinkler Plaza, New York's Americana, Washington's Willard, Los Angeles's Statler. Technicians moved at night. Thin wires were fed behind baseboards. Transmitters were tucked into vents. Rooms were logged, labeled, cataloged. To King, these spaces felt like refuge, the only places where the mask could loosen. In reality, they were stages. Field reports arrived weekly in William Sullivan's office, stamped urgent even when they contained nothing but static. What mattered wasn't what they heard. It was the fact that they were listening. King had grown accustomed to danger. Threat calls were routine. Anonymous letters arrived weekly. Police escorts came and went. But knowing his private life was being mined for weakness produced a new kind of fatigue, a moral exhaustion. "They've decided I can't be human," he told Ralph Abernathy. That winter, the Washington Regular appeared again in bureau notes, still unnamed, still described only as a Negro woman employed in a federal office. Logs placed her at luncheons near Capitol Hill, at evening receptions, after King testified before congressional committees, occasionally at the Willard. To the FBI, each appearance meant sin. To witnesses, it looked like collaboration. She provided briefings on pending legislation, arranged introductions to sympathetic senators. Whether intimacy followed remains unproven, but her presence revealed something essential. In Washington, King's emotional life and political life had merged. Every alliance carried risk, useful by day, dangerous by night. In March 1965, he led the Selma to Montgomery marches. Television cameras captured beatings on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. America watched state violence unfold in real time. Within weeks, the Voting Rights Act advanced. Another victory, another weight. By April, King was back in Los Angeles, the city that blurred admiration and desire more than any other. For him, Los Angeles offered something rare: normalcy disguised as glamour, living rooms instead of sanctuaries, jazz instead of strategy meetings, laughter without urgency. Back east, Georgia Davis Powers remained part of his trusted circle. Their letters alternated between political counsel and tenderness. She joined him at rallies in Louisville, Chicago, and eventually Memphis. Their closeness was open enough that even rivals inside SCLC noticed. Georgia had his ear, Andrew Young later said, and sometimes his heart. The Bureau made no distinction. Dorothy Cotton, Georgia Powers, Dolores Evans, unnamed women, all were folded into a growing file titled Personal Conduct. Each new name gave Hoover another thread to pull. "We will isolate King from the decent Negro community," Hoover told aides. Late 1965 produced the most infamous entry of all, the Willard Hotel. Washington was heavy with rain when King arrived for a ministers' conference. He checked into the Willard, unaware that its walls already carried wires. Microphones had been installed weeks earlier. The assignment was logged: Room 409, Subject King. For several nights, the tapes captured nothing unusual: a chair scraping, a radio murmuring, prayer spoken aloud. Then came a reel dated March 8th. An agent listening from an adjoining room, identified only as T2, filed a handwritten note. At approximately 11:45 p.m., Reverend Logan Kearse engaged in sexual activity with unidentified Negro female in presence of King. Subject King looked on, laughed, and made remarks of a sexual nature encouraging the activity. That single paragraph would poison history. There was no transcript, no corroboration. The tape itself was nearly inaudible. Static layered over street noise and muffled voices. Two other technicians who reviewed the same reel later reported they could distinguish nothing clearly. None of that mattered. When the memo reached Hoover's desk, he underlined the phrase "laughed" and made remarks of a sexual nature. Then he stamped the file: sexual conduct, extreme, a designation normally reserved for foreign black male cases. Within 24 hours, the language hardened. Looked on became encouraged. Encouraged became participated. Assistant Director Sullivan forwarded the summary as proof of King's moral corruption. Hoover told aides the tape revealed the true nature of our so-called moral leader. No one outside the Bureau ever heard it. Inside headquarters, it spread like revelation. Senior domestic intelligence chiefs were briefed. A White House liaison was quietly informed. By the time the rumor reached the Attorney General's orbit, story had replaced sound. King had supposedly witnessed an assault, laughed, urged it on. No woman was identified, no evidence preserved. But the Willard note became the cornerstone of Hoover's crusade. From that moment, surveillance transformed into punishment. Young agents were told that King's depravity justified everything that followed. Every microphone, every tap, every intrusion. Communism no longer mattered. Truth no longer mattered. Humiliation did. Hoover finally had what he wanted. A story so lurid it didn't need proof. A weapon built from rumor, capable of destroying a man's moral authority without ever entering a courtroom. By 1966, the air around King felt heavier. The marches were larger, the threats louder, the faces of his followers older. He had spent nearly a decade leading others toward freedom while quietly losing pieces of his own, and the microphones he couldn't see were only part of it. The real pressure came from within. He weight pressing down on King in 1966 wasn't just political, it was personal. The microphones were invasive, yes, but the deeper strain came from the growing sense that every public victory exposed another private failure. Back in Atlanta, one voice had never fully disappeared: Lizzie Bell. She was steady, kind, almost painfully ordinary. A teacher's aide living in a small house on the west side of the city, far from the movement's glare. Their conversations were never about strategy or power. She asked if he was eating enough, mentioned the weather, reminded him to rest. To agents listening through copper lines, the calls sounded trivial. To King, they sounded like home. The FBI logged every call anyway. They interviewed her neighbors, traced her background, even sent an agent to quietly observe her church attendance. Nothing emerged. One report concluded: subject stable, non-political, unremarkable. Hoover's office underlined the word unremarkable, as if decency itself were suspicious. When nothing useful surfaced, they dropped her file. King never knew she had been watched. North of New York City, in Mount Vernon, another woman faced a different intrusion. Her name never appears in the record. Her friends began receiving polite visits from men posing as reporters, asking about her relationship with King. Dinners, late-night strategy sessions, phone calls. She wrote King a single letter that winter: I believe in what you stand for, but the shadows are spreading. Be careful. He kept it folded in his wallet until the end of his life. By now, guilt had become constant, so had exhaustion. King's opposition to the Vietnam War shattered his fragile alliance with President Johnson. The White House stopped returning calls. Major donors froze funding. Inside SCLC, tempers flared. Too many campaigns, too little money, too much fatigue. Abernathy later said King looked like a man hearing music no one else could hear. Some nights, he sat alone in hotel rooms with the radio on, half expecting to hear his own voice spliced into one of Hoover's anonymous broadcasts. He told friends he no longer trusted phones, walls, or even silence. When the Chicago Freedom Movement began that summer, he saw it as redemption, a chance to confront Northern racism directly. Instead, it nearly broke him. Chicago was brutal in ways Birmingham never was. Crowds hurled bricks instead of words. Housing marches ended in blood. Northern newspapers turned hostile, calling him naive, reckless, messianic. Each night, he returned to the same loneliness. A woman from a local church, part of the volunteer coordination team, began visiting him at headquarters on West 66th Street. She brought meals, typed notes, stayed late. Staff remembered her leaving quietly after midnight, coat over her arm. The FBI labeled her Chicago associate, contact limited to hospitality services. Whether it was more than that, no one knows. For King, even simple kindness felt like rescue. Meanwhile, leaks had begun. Reporters in Washington received anonymous envelopes hinting that a moral revelation about King was coming. Editors compared phrasing and concluded it came from the same source, Hoover. Most refused to publish. Ben Bradley of The Washington Post later admitted everyone knew Hoover hated King, and that unsigned morality files smelled of manipulation. Still, gossip spread through Washington dinners and congressional cloakrooms. King felt it immediately. Invitations thinned. Senators stopped returning calls. When he entered rooms, conversations slowed just enough to notice. "They're trying to turn the air itself against me," he told Abernathy. By early 1967, the strain showed in his body: high blood pressure, insomnia, stress tremors. He lived on coffee. Lost weight his suits couldn't hide. His sermons changed, his voice dropped, his cadence slowed. Victory gave way to prophecy. He spoke more of death than deliverance. Privately, he began speaking of his own end. To Abernathy, "I don't think I'll see 40. To Dorothy Cotton, "They may kill me, but they will not kill the movement." To Coretta, "If they take me, promise me you'll make them see I was still a man." The FBI recorded those words too. In their logic, each confession proved collapse. A 1967 memo concluded, "Subject's increased fatalism indicates internal deterioration under moral pressure. They never considered the pressure might be theirs." That same year, Memphis called. Sanitation workers went on strike after 2 black men were crushed to death in a garbage truck. King saw their struggle as the embodiment of everything he believed: dignity, labor, justice. He went against his doctor's advice, against Coretta's pleas, against every warning. The FBI followed immediately. Observers were assigned to the Lorraine Motel. They logged visitors to room 306, phone calls, meetings. They even noted his laughter with Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson, as if joy itself were subversive. On April 3, 1968, King stood at the Mason Temple. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said. "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you." Those in the room felt it, a farewell disguised as prophecy. The next evening, April 4th, 1968, at 6:01 p.m., he stepped onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. A rifle cracked from across the street. The bullet entered his right cheek, tore through his jaw, and lodged in his spine. He fell instantly. Ralph Abernathy rushed to him. Andrew Young shouted for help. Onlookers pointed toward the boarding house across the street. Within hours, the world knew. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead at 39. In Washington, Hoover was informed within minutes. His only recorded words that night: "This will quiet things down." The following morning, Hoover moved quickly. Within hours of King's death, he ordered the Bureau's most sensitive material locked down. Entire sections of King's file were sealed. Others were removed entirely and transferred to a private vault under restricted access. The phrase "personal conduct" disappeared from official summaries. What had been voyeurism was relabeled counterintelligence. Publicly, The FBI mourned. Privately, it exhaled. The danger, as Hoover saw it, was over. The assassin fled. James Earl Ray, an escaped convict, a drifter, crossed state lines under aliases, carrying multiple passports and a suspicious amount of cash. 2 months later, he was captured at Heathrow Airport in London. He pleaded guilty in 1969. Then he recanted. Ray claimed he had been manipulated by a mysterious handler named Raoul, a man who provided money, documents, and direction. He said he didn't even know who the target was until the final moments. The FBI dismissed the story as fantasy. But the questions never went away. Ray had no history of racial violence, no clear political ideology. Yet, he had the resources of someone being helped. The rifle found near the scene was linked to him, but ballistics were disputed. Witnesses reported seeing another man flee the area, and King's usual security detail had been removed that day, leaving the Lorraine Motel unusually exposed. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reviewed the evidence. Their conclusion was careful and explosive. They determined that James Earl Ray fired the shot that killed Dr. King, but they also concluded there was a likelihood of conspiracy. They named no co-conspirators. The ambiguity lingered like smoke, official enough to acknowledge, too dangerous to resolve. Coretta Scott King never accepted the lone gunman theory. She spent decades demanding a full reinvestigation, insisting her husband had been killed not by a single racist drifter, but by a network of power terrified of what he was becoming. By 1968, King was no longer just a civil rights leader. He was building something far more threatening. He was uniting Black Americans, white laborers, and the poor into a single nonviolent force capable of paralyzing Washington. Their fear wasn't of a riot, Coretta later said. It was of a resurrection. Her children echoed that belief. So did many who had watched the machinery move too quickly after his death. In 1999, the King family brought a civil case in Memphis. A jury heard weeks of testimony. At the end, they found that James Earl Ray had been part of a broader conspiracy involving governmental agencies and others. The verdict received almost no media coverage. The Justice Department quietly dismissed it, but the doubt survived. And always, there were the tapes, thousands of hours of recordings, wiretaps, hotel microphones, informant calls, preserved but hidden. They weren't about murder, they were about character. When the church committee in the 1970s attempted to subpoena those recordings, the FBI refused. They cited national security. Even senators were denied access. One congressional staffer later recalled being told privately, "If you heard what's on those tapes, you'd lose faith in government altogether." That was enough. The demand faded. Silence returned. So what waits in 2027? That is the year the court-ordered seal expires. Every tape, every transcript, every rumor that fueled Hoover's obsession, locked in the National Archives, waiting. Will the recordings reveal transgression or entrapment? Will they expose a flawed man or a corrupted state? Will Hoover's ghost finally stand trial, or will America turn away again, unwilling to face how far its institutions went to punish a dreamer for being human? When those boxes open, the truth will not arrive clean. It won't sound like a verdict. It will breathe. Inside the sealed archives are fragments of a human life, laughter caught mid-sentence, prayers spoken to empty rooms, guilt whispered when no one else was supposed to hear, not confessions, not crimes, but moments. Moments recorded by men who mistook privacy for evidence and imperfection for leverage. Coretta Scott King understood that danger immediately. In the days after the assassination, she moved through the world as if underwater, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, history accelerating around her, yet beneath the grief was calculation. She knew Hoover might try one last time to poison her husband's memory, to reduce his sacrifice to scandal. A week after the funeral, she told a friend quietly, they couldn't kill the man they wanted to destroy, so they killed the body instead. Within weeks, she began sealing his legacy before the Bureau could reopen its war. She founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. She controlled the narrative. She insisted that his name remain synonymous with justice, not gossip. The SCLC followed her lead. So did the press. In death, the image hardened. The man who wrestled with doubt was turned into marble. Inside the FBI, Hoover watched this transformation with open contempt. A memo dated May 1968 captured his fury. Public reaction following subject's death undermines Bureau objectives. Future strategy requires redirection toward preserving institutional credibility. That phrase, preserving institutional credibility, marked the end. The Bureau could not defeat martyrdom. By 1977, under pressure from the Church Committee and civil liberties advocates, a federal judge ordered King's surveillance archives sealed for 50 years. Every tape, every transcript, every rumor, locked away until 2027. Coretta's silence became armor. When asked publicly about the FBI's allegations, she offered no rebuttal, no defense, only this: my husband believed in redemption. She refused to separate the saint from the sinner, or allow the country to pretend it ever could. In doing so, she preserved something deeper than reputation. She preserved humanity. The truth is this: Martin Luther King Jr. was never undone by sex. He was undone by expectation. A nation demanded purity from a man it first drove to exhaustion. It demanded perfection from someone it refused to protect. It worshiped him only after breaking him. The microphones did not define him. The rumors did not defeat him. What defined him was the choice to keep loving a country that was actively trying to destroy him. When he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he wasn't thinking about files or tapes. He was thinking about workers, about children, about the promised land he might not reach. He had warned America that love would cost something. He never promised it would spare him. And somewhere, behind steel doors and fluorescent lights, the reels still wait, unlabeled, unplayed, humming faintly with the sound of a man caught between holiness and hunger, destiny and desire. A man who walked the narrow line between flesh and faith until the very end. The gunfire in Memphis did not end the story. It buried it alive. James Earl Ray's capture 3 months later only deepened the fog. He was an escaped convict, a drifter, a man of limited education but uncanny luck. His version of events never quite aligned with the evidence, and the evidence never fully aligned with itself. Ray said he had been recruited by a man named Raoul, a handler, a guide, a fixer. Raoul, Ray claimed, provided money, false documents, and direction. He said Raoul chose the locations, arranged the movements, and vanished the moment the shot was fired. Ray insisted he did not even know who the target was until the final moments. The FBI dismissed the story as fantasy, but the inconsistencies refused to disappear. Ray had no record of racial violence, no clear political ideology. Yet he possessed multiple passports, international travel plans, and more than $10,000 in cash. The rifle recovered near the scene was traced to Ray, but the ballistics evidence was never airtight. Some experts questioned whether it was the fatal weapon at all. Witnesses reported seeing another man fleeing the area moments after the shot. And, perhaps most disturbing of all, King's usual security detail had been quietly removed that day. The Lorraine Motel was unusually exposed. In the years that followed, the official story hardened. Lone gunman, case closed. But outside official channels, doubt grew. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the question. After months of review, their conclusions split the difference between certainty and suspicion. They stated that James Earl Ray fired the shot that killed Dr. King, but they also concluded there was a likelihood of conspiracy. No names were attached, no agencies held accountable. The finding was precise enough to acknowledge doubt, vague enough to bury it. The ambiguity lingered like smoke in a sealed room. Coretta Scott King never let it settle. She understood what her husband had become in the final year of his life. He was no longer just a civil rights leader. He was threatening the structure of American power itself. By opposing the Vietnam War, he had alienated the White House. By organizing the Poor People's Campaign, he was preparing to bring thousands of poor Americans, black, white, Latino, to occupy Washington nonviolently. That terrified the establishment. "You can negotiate with riots," Coretta once said. "You cannot negotiate with moral authority." For decades, she demanded accountability. She met with investigators, filed petitions, spoke where she was allowed and where she wasn't. In 1999, the King family pursued a civil trial in Memphis, not for money, for truth. The jury heard weeks of testimony, including evidence of government surveillance, suspicious movements, and witness intimidation. At the end, they reached a verdict few Americans ever heard about. They concluded that James Earl Ray was part of a larger conspiracy involving governmental agencies and others. The verdict received minimal media coverage. The Justice Department dismissed it without reopening the case. But for the King family, it confirmed what they had always believed. Martin Luther King Jr. had not been killed by a single man. He had been removed, and always, hovering over every theory, every investigation, every unanswered question, were the tapes, thousands of hours of recordings, not about murder, about control, wiretaps, hotel rooms, intimate moments cataloged by men who believed exposure was power. The church committee tried to hear them. They were denied. Courts demanded they be sealed. And so they wait in a federal archive until 2027. When those seals finally break, the shock will not come from scandal. It will come from recognition. Because what the tapes truly document is not a man's sins, but a government's obsession. Hours upon hours of surveillance not aimed at preventing violence, not at protecting national security, but at manufacturing leverage, at finding something, anything, human enough to be twisted into disqualification. The danger King posed was never personal. It was structural. He threatened to reorganize morality itself. A black preacher telling America that racism was sin, that poverty was policy, that war was theft, that love could dismantle power without firing a shot, that terrified institutions built on force. So they listened. They listened when he laughed, when he doubted, when he rested, when he sought comfort. And every time they heard a human being instead of a statue, they called it evidence. But here is the truth. History keeps circling back to, even if every rumor were true, it would not erase the movement. Even if King failed privately, it would not invalidate his public truth, because moral clarity does not require moral perfection. That idea, the demand that leaders be flawless, has always been a weapon, used selectively, deployed strategically, aimed downward. King understood this near the end. He told one confidant, "If they ever show the tapes, I hope people listen for the pain, not the noise." What remains most damning is not what the FBI recorded. It's what they missed. They missed a man who kept marching after being warned he would die. They missed a man who knew his phone was tapped and still prayed aloud. They missed a man who loved his country enough to confront it, even as it dismantled him. When King spoke about love as a force stronger than hate, it was not theory. It was survival. He was not naive about power. He had felt its teeth. By 1968, he was moving slower, speaking softer, but thinking further ahead than ever before. He was no longer chasing civil rights alone. He was building a moral coalition. Poor whites from Appalachia, Latino farm workers, black sanitation workers in Memphis. That terrified everyone who benefited from division. His assassination froze that convergence in time. The Poor People's Campaign limped forward without him. The war machine rolled on. Racism adapted, and the tapes were locked away, not to protect King, but to protect the institutions that feared what he represented. That is why 2027 matters. Not because it will reveal scandal, but because it will reveal scale. The scale of intrusion, the scale of obsession, the scale of fear. When Americans finally confront how much power was used to monitor one man's loneliness, they may finally understand why he mattered so much. King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." He never said it bends quickly or easily or without resistance. Sometimes it bends only after the truth has been buried for half a century. In the end, the question was never really about sex. It was never about tapes. It was never about rumor. Those were tools, not truths. The real question was whether America could accept a prophet who was human, because prophets are dangerous when they are perfect, but they are unforgivable when they are real. Martin Luther King Jr. did not fail because he was flawed. He was targeted because he refused to be silent, because he kept moving even after the cost became clear, because he chose love as a weapon in a nation addicted to force, because he believed poor people, not politicians, were the real moral majority. By the time he reached Memphis, King knew the risk. He said it openly. "I may not get there with you." Those were not the words of a reckless man. They were the words of someone who had already counted the price and paid it anyway. When the bullet struck him on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, it did not kill his ideas. It froze them in time. America canonized him quickly after that. A holiday, a statue, a sanitized version of his voice, stripped of its anger, its warnings, its demands. The same nation that surveilled his loneliness now celebrates his courage. The same government that tried to destroy his character now quotes his speeches. That contradiction is not accidental. It is the American pattern. Break the prophet, then build the monument. What the sealed files threaten to expose in 2027 is not a man's weakness, but a system's fear. Fear of moral clarity, fear of coalition, fear of a love strong enough to disrupt profit, hierarchy, and war. If the tapes are released, they will not dethrone King. They will indict the watchers. They will show how far power will go when it cannot control a message, only the messenger. And maybe then, finally, the country will hear what King was actually saying, that justice is not polite, that peace is not passive, that love is not soft, it is disruptive, it demands sacrifice, it exposes hypocrisy. Martin Luther King Jr. lived with that truth. He died because of it. And long after the microphones are silent and the files are opened, that truth will remain. Not clean, not comfortable, but necessary. Because history does not need perfect saints. It needs courageous humans, willing to walk forward even when the cost is everything.